might be cut, among other consequences. They also clarified their mission by offering their achievements in El Salvador as a model for Iraq. In reaction to the favorable coverage of this audacious stand, one of the leading academic specialists on Central America, Thomas Walker, distributed an op-ed to newspapers around the country, describing the free elections under U.S. domination, hailed by Cheney, Rumsfeld, and others. These elections, he reminds us, were held against a backdrop of state-sponsored terror, which had taken the lives of tens of thousands of innocent civilians, crippled civil society, and completely silenced the opposition media. The candidates, moreover, were limited to a narrow spectrum from center to far right. Voter abstention was threatened with murder, and votes were cast using sequentially numbered, identifiable ballots, deposited in clear plastic boxes in front of armed soldiers, so translucent that the ballots could be read even when duly folded. This was clearly the wrong story. The op-ed was rejected. That came as no surprise to Walker. He is also the author of the major scholarly studies of Nicaragua, and through the 1980s, when Nicaragua was the top story of the day, he sent several op-eds a year to the New York Times. None appeared. Again, the wrong story. A review of op-eds and editorials in the liberal national press at the peak moments of coverage of Nicaragua revealed the familiar split between hawks and doves, about 50-50. Demonstrating the balance and openness in the free press. The hawks called for escalating the international terrorist assault. The doves countered that violence was not succeeding, so the United States should find another means to compel Nicaraguans to adhere to the Central American mode and adopt the regional standards of Washington's preferred states, El Salvador and Guatemala, then engaged in gruesome state terror. Walker and Latin American specialists generally fell outside of this spectrum, and thus were virtually ignored, sometimes in startling ways. One example, bearing on democracy promotion, was the 1984 Nicaragua elections, which had doctrinally unacceptable results. The Sandinistas won, and therefore did not take place, though they were closely observed and generally approved, including by hostile observers, and a delegation of specialists on Nicaragua sent by the Professional Association of Latin American Scholars, all suppressed. One of those observers was José Figueres of Costa Rica, who joined in pronouncing the 1984 elections fair by Latin American standards, and was also ignored. More generally, though passionately anti-communist and anti-Sandinista, and a strong supporter of Washington and U.S. corporate investors, he felt that Nicaraguans should be left to deal with their own problems in their own way. Consequently, the leading figure of Central American democracy was barred from the press throughout the years of Reagan's terrorist wars in the region, or, in the preferred version, the years of dedication to democracy promotion, a familiar practice, as we have seen. In praising the Salvadoran model, Bush administration democracy promoters failed to mention one of the important contributions of Reagan's war on terror. In Iraq, the private security firms that are the second largest component of the coalition of the willing are dipping into experienced pools of trained fighters, almost 70% from El Salvador, it is estimated. The trained killers from the Reagan-run state terrorist apparatus can earn better pay pursuing their craft in Iraq than in what remains of their societies at home. The familiar patterns have been followed from the traditional domains of U.S. power in the Western Hemisphere to the newer ones in Central Asia. After the May 2005 massacres in Uzbekistan, U.S. officials have walked a fine line, saying they were deeply disturbed over the killings, but also expressing alarm over anti-government violence. Taking a more assertive stand, British, French, and European Union officials have denounced the deadly crackdown and called for international observers to be let in to investigate. Washington distanced itself even from Europe's light tap on the wrist, preferring more open support for the tyrant Islam Karimov, who enjoys such pleasures as murdering dissidents by boiling them to death, according to former British Ambassador Craig Murray. Murray was recalled to London for such indiscretions, not to speak of his description of Karimov as George Bush's man in Central Asia, praised by senior members of the Bush administration and backed to the hilt because of Uzbekistan's significant reserves of oil and gas. In his cables to London in 2002 and 2003, Murray had written, U.S. plays down human rights situation in Uzbekistan, a dangerous policy, increasing repression, combined with poverty will promote Islamic terrorism. And, as seen from Tashkent, U.S. policy is not much focused on democracy or freedom. It is about oil, gas, and hegemony. In Uzbekistan, the U.S. pursues those ends through supporting a ruthless dictatorship. The State Department gave Uzbekistan a favorable human rights assessment, Murray said, in order to free up hundreds of millions of dollars in aid. In a secret letter on March 18, 2003, as Bush and Blair were launching the Iraq War, Murray wrote, Last year, the U.S. gave $500 million in aid to Uzbekistan, about a quarter of its military aid. Bush and Powell repeatedly hail Karimov as a friend and ally, yet this regime has at least 7,000 prisoners of conscience. It is a one-party state without freedom of speech, without freedom of media, without freedom of movement, without freedom of assembly, without freedom of religion. It practices systematically the most hideous tortures on thousands. Most of the population live in conditions precisely analogous with medieval serfdom. Karimov was not backed enthusiastically enough for his taste, however. Dissatisfied, he compelled Washington to shift its air bases to neighboring tyrannies. The U.S. is trying to cover its retreat behind a smokescreen of belated concern for human rights abuses in Uzbekistan, Murray wrote. Suddenly, one of their most intensively courted allies has been discovered, shock, horror, to be an evil dictator. Remember Saddam? The dictator, it turned out, preferred the style of Russian President Vladimir Putin to that of his Western suitors, though not all are withdrawing. Of all Western ministers, the most frequent guest in Uzbekistan, who most uncritically praises the regime, is Joschka Fischer, the trendy German foreign minister and former 1960s radical. Prior to Karimov's slap in Washington's face, it was widely expected that the United States might be the savior of this dying autocratic regime, writes David Wall of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, noting Washington's increase in funding for the Uzbek government, and the fact that independent observers inside Uzbekistan say that U.S. presence in the country is up to twice as large as Washington is willing to admit. At the same time, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice exercised a waiver to allow continued military aid to nearby Kazakhstan on national security grounds, despite what the State Department acknowledged were numerous steps backward on human rights. Washington will stay fully engaged despite what Rice outlined as Kazakhstan's many recent regressions, from a starting point that was not exactly elevated. U.S. military aid enhances democracy, Rice said, intoning rhetoric that is as familiar as its grim meaning. In neighboring Azerbaijan, at the opening of a pipeline that will carry Caspian oil to the west, on a route that avoids Russia and Iran, the U.S. Energy Secretary delivered a ringing message from President Bush. As Azerbaijan deepens its democratic and market economic reforms, this pipeline can help generate balanced economic growth and provide a foundation for a prosperous and just society that advances the cause of freedom. A few days earlier, the New York Times reported the Azerbaijani police beat pro-democracy demonstrators with truncheons when opposition parties yelling "free elections" defied the government's ban on protests against President Ilham